bên mèo Waya di bem tur tiar mata em mong sangaka ablong lingil bela autorar odli yang.
Thanks again to all of you for coming today to listen again to Annette Kuhlem. Dr. Kuhlem has done now three research campaigns here in Palau, and you well remember the last one where she had the excavations on some of the terraces and then the really phenomenal findings of burial sites on these terraces. This is now 1 year ago that she then left back to Germany with all kind of the research material and the findings that she had. Her team has been now working for a year on analyzing and finding out dating on these objects that have been found. And I think everybody is now very keen to hear the results of these findings of her archaeological research here in Palau. I want to thank you, Annette, again for coming over to Palau for this presentation here today, and later on I can tell you a few more good things that we're planning for the future. And I will give now the floor to Annette Kuhlem, and please listen to her wonderful presentation tonight. Thank you very much, Annette.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and thank you all for coming and for your interest in basically the results of the archaeological work and of especially all the lab analysis that we did in the past year. The last lecture that I gave at the Civic Center was pretty much about the fact that we had found human burials in 2 sites in Aymelik and in Narard in the Belau district. And this has been an interesting year because after I basically made my way back to Germany with all sorts of samples, one of the longest flights ever, still with all the COVID restrictions, and then pretty much sent all this out across the world to have it analyzed and dated, etc. So I just very briefly, I'm always the one up here speaking, but we have a big, very interdisciplinary, very international team, and everybody contributes their piece to the puzzle. And that's why I always want to give credit to my colleagues. One of them is here with us today, Ms. Julie Tilley, who is our cultural consultant and our oral historian, and we could definitely not do what we're doing without her. So thank you very much to Julie. I also want to point out that we are by far not the first ones to be doing archaeological research here in Palau on Babeldaub and on the earthworks of Babeldaub. So a big thank you also to Jolie Liston in the back, because she was very, very helpful and very friendly in sharing what she knows and helping us when we set up the project in the beginning, making contact. So I definitely want to use this opportunity to thank her for all the assistance that she has provided for us. Why are we interested in basically in Palau? That's often one of the questions, and there's a couple of research questions that we as a research team are trying to answer on different islands in the Pacific. Basically, we are interested in ecosystem research and how humans shape and alter their environments, and we have done that on different islands across the Pacific. So in French Polynesia, on Rapa Nui or Easter Island, in the Solomon Islands, in the Chatham Islands off of New Zealand, in New Zealand proper, on Robinson Crusoe Island off the coast of South America, in Guam, and then finally here in Palau. And I gotta say, this here is by far the most impressive, the most monumental expression of archaeology and yeah, of monumentality that we've ever dealt with. And I just want to show you as a bit of an introduction to those of you who have not seen my last lecture. This is one of the many, many sites of these earthworks constructed, yeah, from loam and clay and millions of tons of material that we have to imagine that people transported up the hills, shaped these human-made earthworks or terraces, and all of that we have to bear in mind with very simple tools. So just a quick, a quick reminder of the project, how we did it, how we set it up. We started out with doing drone survey of different sites in order to get a good idea about their extent, about also the amount of how many earthworks are there even. And from this bird's eye view, you get a very, very good perspective that you don't necessarily get from the ground. These are all the sites that we included in our project. All of those we documented 3D through drone imagery, and then we excavated a lot of test pits and then more extensive pits in areas that were of specific interest. These are the digital elevation models. These are just 3 examples. The upper one on the left from Aymalik, on the right also Aymalik, and the lower left from Ngramlengwi. And on these digital elevation models, you see a lot of details that you would not see in a satellite photo or even in an aerial photo from closer up. And that was basically the basis on which we decided where to place all our excavation trenches. We created these 3D models because once you're at the other side of the earth, which for us is Germany, we still have the possibility to get a good look at these sites, to tilt and zoom and look at details. So that is a tool that was very handy when you have a limited time here doing field research and then doing all the analysis and basically understanding the big picture with all the different factors back at home in Germany. These 3D models also gave us the possibility to put these digital cross-sections, so we know about the elevation, which is important when it comes to estimating the amount of material that was actually used and transported to build these monumental earthworks. This was the first phase 1, where we actually put a shovel in the ground, and we did these test trenches on 10 of the selected earthworks and did a total of 40 test trenches all across Belau, basically to understand the function, the construction methods, and mainly what these sites were used for. I'm showing this picture because this is pretty much the setup or the sequence that we found everywhere. And only in 3 of these 40 test trenches did we reach natural bedrock. All the rest is human transported, human applied, and human compacted material. So that is an absolutely mind-boggling dimension of human landscape transformation that we have here in Palau. The first phase of our excavations already gave some very interesting results. I already mentioned the amount of human applied material, the amount of human landscape transformation. And what was very unexpected really is the fact that we found hardly any evidence of erosion. Now we all know there are harsh rains here, there's a marked rainy season, tropical storms, and we can see it nowadays if there are modern construction projects. You got landslides, you got basically soil being washed into the sea, affects the mangroves, the reefs, etc. And then you have these sites, some of which are over 2,000 years old, that have not budged in all this time. And that is something absolutely amazing. And it speaks to the ingenuity and the level of skill and technology that people had all this time ago when they transported all this material and basically created these giant sites in the landscape. A very important aspect when it comes to the question of function is what we found repeatedly on the very top. So we have this general setup that you have these like orange or yellowish clay layers, and then on the top you have human-made soils, and that is a big deal because people basically optimized their horticultural techniques. They got the best possible yields by including organic material, namely charcoal that binds nutrients, it binds humidity, and so they made their own very, very viable fields by applying garden soil. So that is a very, very big aspect of this landscape transformation, and also to our questions about the functions. Then inside of these garden soils, we found repeated planting pits. So basically from this sedimentological analysis, which my colleagues Hans-Rudolf Bock and Andreas Mieth are the experts for, we know that large areas, especially the terraced areas, the horizontal areas, they were used for large-scale horticulture. And I just want to point out that those so-called archaeological dark earth, that's not a unique phenomenon in Palau. It's something that is done all over the world to increase harvest, to increase yield, and to optimize agriculture or horticulture. And due to the results that we found up on Babeldaub, we can add Palau to the list of countries where we have these human-made garden soils. That was one of our big when it comes to the function. So we have large-scale horticulture. It's an optimization of land use. The horticultural techniques have been optimized, and all of that had the potential of feeding a large population. And that is something that we have to bear in mind because it is very different from the picture that we see on Babeldaub today, with a very sparsely settled area, really, and that must have been very different in the past if we look at the amount of agricultural land that was created, and then also the amount of earthworks that we find in the landscape and the amount of material that was transported to make these. All of this speaks for a large population in the past. Interestingly, even today, many fields and small farms are still located on top of the terraces, and they are still using those human-made garden soils that were created such long time ago. And the basically chemical analysis of these soil samples that we took, I unfortunately don't have the results yet, but we know that basically the water storage capacity of those soils was very high in comparison to the natural soils, and that is a big advantage in horticulture. Second phase of our excavation, we looked at the topmost areas. And these so-called crowns come in very different shapes and sizes. Many of them we actually established through these digital cross-sections that we were able to make are pyramidal in shape. I have the shape of a flat top pyramid. Some of you might remember that was kind of a thing that went through the press last year, the green pyramids of Palau. And at the beginning I was a little bit uncomfortable with that term, but it turns out that we do have quite a lot of those crowns that have this shape of a flat top pyramid. And we excavated this site on the lower left in Aymelik, Ngerbunzelbad, or Ubalangra Ngermelik. And this is our little hilltop fortress. And one of our team members, Kyle, he is here tonight. And they did all the heavy lifting. So thank you very much at this point. And what we found was, this is a digital mosaic. What we found was about a meter or 3 feet below the surface of this crown. We found this extensive, well-laid stone layer. And in that area, we found human burials, 3 facing north-south up in this area. and then another 3 facing east-west. This is one, believe it or not, and then there's another very decomposed remain of a skull right there. We colored them so to give you a little bit of a better view of them. And this is very significant because so far the problem with the soils on Babel Daob was that they're very acidic and they decompose human bones. So while there have been burial pits found before, often the remains of bone were too little to tell really anything about orientation, about position of posture, and all that obviously is culturally very significant. How you lay your dead into the ground is something that is not just done in any which way. The 3 burials on the lower levels, they were oriented east-west, and interestingly, they were placed directly on top of that stone layer. So that is something that is quite unusual. You can even see that there's like a rim of raised stones around here. And then we have these 3 individuals that are actually oriented almost north-south. And these are the ones where we have really the most information, mainly because we had a fireplace. That is the black area right here in the corner. We had a fireplace associated with this burial. And the fireplace gives us a very exact date of when that burial took place. It is very different than just finding a random piece of charcoal somewhere in a fill layer. That could have been something that is just filled in with the mix, no? And so it's a substantial fireplace. So it is almost like 10 centimeters, 3 inches more or less thick. And we got some samples that we were able to date. And we have one sample for this individual on the bottom, and one sample that we dated for this individual on the top. So we are talking about an age for these burials of 1,300 years, which is really, really amazing that we have such well-preserved bones, and I do have to put that in quotes because in the grand scheme of things, they were very, very decomposed, which is also the reason why we left them in the ground and didn't take them out, because they basically would have just fallen to dust, no? So we can already establish that we have a multifunctional use of these earthworks. So you have gardening on the terraced areas. In the same site, you have burials on the very top on the crown. So there's a connection between these 2 activities, which don't necessarily appear to somebody of our generation to be something that goes hand in hand. But here they are in the same context. The next site where we excavated a crown is up in Ngarard in the Ngeklau district called Ngerbengay. And this is the area. The lower photo was taken by Jolie List, and I want to say like in the mid-90s. She was kind enough to provide that because really now the site is so overgrown that you can be standing right here, and if our team hadn't cut all the vegetation, you would have just thought that's just where the forest continues. We excavated that crown or that berm on the south part of the site. That's the area. And also here we found these oval pits that are parallel oriented, pointing them out here again. The situation is quite different because the area around them is all the natural bedrock, so the saprolite, which is a very decomposed, very soft kind of volcanic rock that you can carve very easily. And it turned out that these pits actually were carved and reached all the way into the bedrock. And you can see here that they overlap each other. So they must have used this area for burials for quite some time. This is the very first piece of human bone that we found, which, basically, if you don't really keep your eyes peeled and know exactly what you're looking for, this is very, very easy to overlook. It's basically just like, a little piece of what Jolie called something like putty. So that was the very first indicator that we are actually dealing with human graves. But then we did find this still pretty decomposed skull in this bigger pit, of which we have pretty much the entire length. But it was still pretty much only the skull and especially the teeth that are the hardest material in the human body that were preserved. We have another piece of a skull in that pit, just a mandibule, which has been, basically that grave has been disturbed when digging a later grave. So this mandibule was in a position where it would never end up if somebody hadn't dug a second pit and kind of jumbled the bones around. And but these teeth are also very well preserved, whereas the rest of the body is completely decomposed. We have two skulls where the body continues into the unexcavated part and is basically covered by this berm. So what we have here is these overlapping grave pits, and a very different situation than what we had in Aimelique. But we also have a date for this pit right here, where in this area, on top of the grave fill, we had another fireplace. These are even older, so they are 1,800 years old. So that is, yeah, really amazing to me. So also that might explain the fact that these are so much more decomposed, 500 years older than the ones in Aimelique. Yeah, but in general, not only for Palau or for earthworks, in general for Pacific Islands, for Oceania, these are very, very early dates on human remains. So that's what makes them so significant. So we have these two sites, Ubalanga Aimelique and Ngerbengay, and they were both used in the same way. Basically agriculture in the terraced areas, and then burial sites for the dead in the elevated areas on top. And but there are marked differences between these sites in the shape and form, and that's very interesting in general when dealing with the earthworks, that there are no two ones that are the same. But when it comes to the construction techniques, what I showed earlier, the sequence of what was put down, basically this saprolite, then the yellowish clay, and then those garden soils, that is the same. So there is some not similarities, but some, samenesses, that's not a word, but yeah, so there are some things that are the same, even though like the physical shape might be very different. This is a picture from the 23rd of December 2021, and this is Kiblas. I've also seen her here. We decided to leave these skeletons in the ground because we were able to document them very precisely with these 3D documentation techniques that we have at our disposal. And so we decided to leave the dead where they were initially buried, just took some small samples of, for possible anthropological analyses and possible DNA analyses, and then had this very touching reburial ceremony just before Christmas. And these are one of the 3D documentations, and we sent all these files to our physical anthropologist, Julia Gre in Berlin. And you can slow this down, you can zoom in more, you can look at a lot of details, and basically do the analysis without having to remove the bones from their context, which also I think for ethical reasons is a very good possibility to go about these kind of anthropological analyses. It was quite surprising looking at the state of conservation how much Julia was able to discern from those few samples and the 3D models that we provided her with. So one thing is, if you look at the person, especially the person in the middle, you will see that he's very, very slim, no? And the upper arms are placed very close to the body. The shoulders are even kind of curled inwards. And the only way that skeleton will come to lay like that after decomposing is if there's some kind of rigid mat holding the body together. So that is something that is a very nice parallel that we have with historic accounts, by, for example, that have been recorded by Augustin Krämer, a death mat that were used exactly for that, to wrap a body before placing them in the grave pit. And we have that exact practice, or that exact kind of custom 1,300 years ago. So that is very significant when we're talking about continuity, about how much that was done back then is still being done today, or was done still in historic recorded times. We found under the microscope a large amount of sea sponge remains, which is very surprising because, yeah, we're almost at 200 feet above sea level. And yeah, so basically that is something where humans have transported sea sponge in whatever shape and form up and placed them around the body of the deceased. I know that Jolie found mats of sea sponge, something similar also up north. But that is a very interesting find from, yeah, basically around the bones of the skeletons, that in some function they had sea sponges placed in the grave pit with them. Those are the sea sponge, they call them spiculae, which is basically the microscopic remains of the skeleton of a sea sponge, and that's what we still find under the microscope. So the anthropological analysis could tell us a few things, mainly based on the dental wear of the teeth. And that tells us something about the age. No, I know there's this saying that somebody is long in the tooth, which is basically somebody of age, you say, is long in the tooth. And so you can analyze how much dental wear there is, and that gives you an idea about the age of the individual person. So that is basically what Julia could find out. First of all, the individual is facing west. It seems like he's facing towards the right on this picture, but he's actually, he or she, sorry, is facing towards the west. And the dental wear shows that he's at least adolescent, and there are no signs of illness or malnutrition in the dental records. For this individual in the middle, he was facing completely upwards, and the dental wear points to a young adult. His enamel, his teeth, on the other hand, they do show that there was an episode of stress in his childhood due to illness or malnutrition, and that is something that you can see in the enamel of the teeth even 1,300 years later. And the individual, I find that quite endearing, had an overbite. So it had like the inside of the incisors, they were more worn than the rest of the teeth. So yeah, that was an individual with an overbite. This person right here could be narrowed down even better, because there were several teeth that we submitted, and that's an individual 17 to 30 years old with apparently a very healthy history, no signs of illness or malnutrition, but he had brown stains on one of his incisors, which we still have in the lab to see whether this is a very early example of chewing betel nut. So it definitely has been done during the excavation up there, so that would be very nice to see that even back then in the same area people were already chewing betel nut. So if you look at this individual in the very center, he is also quite young, and that is something that is surprising to us. So 17 to 25 years old, no signs of illness or malnutrition. And then the last individual, he is basically just this set of legs, and the upper body, this is where he is on the big picture, he or she, sorry, is continues on into the unexcavated part. And here we really, the only means, we didn't have teeth, the only means was basically the length of the limbs, and then the thickness of the bones themselves. So that points towards an adult individual. What was very surprising to us is that the majority of these analyzed individuals were much younger than what we expected, because if you look at the kind of very exclusive resting place, now you have this very limited area up on top of such a giant earthwork. The idea is that those are people of a high status, somebody of a high rank, and at least like from my cultural background, which obviously isn't necessarily applicable here, that is something that you don't necessarily expect for such a young person. No? And what's interesting is that this might point towards this system of like hereditary title, as opposed to a political acquisition of high status, as it is in other islands in the Pacific, where basically with age and accomplishments and your deeds, you reach a high status only after a certain age. So that is a very interesting hint that we found by the surprisingly young age of these individuals. This is the only individual from Ngerwengay, from Gerard, and also we are dealing with a young adult, or an adolescent to a young adult. So the same situation here, that a rather young person was buried in this very exclusive, very limited kind of burial place. I just found, I looked into a couple of references. I found some references in Crema about like hereditary title, and that people even at a young age can already have a high status. And I talked to Julie about it, but this is one of those questions where obviously, I'm very happy for any insight, any information that could help us interpret what we found in the archaeological record. So the big question last year, and it unfortunately still is a big question, is DNA analysis, because that was something with these very unusually well-preserved bones, but still, pretty decomposed bones. We were hoping to get some DNA, some ancient DNA that would tell us possibly, ideally, relationships of modern Palauans to these people from the earthworks, then relationships between burials from the rock islands, and then of course migrations in the Pacific in general. Where did people come from? I gotta say, the labs in general after COVID are very backlogged, so things take a long time, but at least I have one little piece of good news, which is that of the 2 of our samples, they have enough human DNA to go into further processing, so there's still hope that we will find out a little bit more about who these people were. So one thing that the both sides have in common, because we are interested in basically back then the archaeological record, and then traditional practices today, how much continuity is there? Because one of the very astonishing facts for us really was that there are so few oral traditions and so few stories about the earthworks. The only one that I really know about is the serpent from Elewi Hamlet. If anybody knows of any other stories or has heard any kind of explanations from the oral traditions, I'd be very grateful to hear about it. But one thing that I have heard is that the elevated places, that the high areas, is something where even the Christian cemeteries today, they're still mostly located in high areas, and there seems to be a connection as well to the souls making their way to Angar, and that it's a more direct line. That is something that I've heard in that context. And again, some similarities from the archaeological record. And again, I always ask for input when it comes, basically to the cultural background, which obviously is not my own, no? One very nice thing that seems to be a little detail, but turned out to be, kind of quite a big deal in the Ngerwenge site in Belau. We found 2 pieces of coral, one of them even perforated, so it was probably used as some kind of a pendant, inside one of the grave pits. And that is something that I asked about. I already showed this slide at the last lecture at the Civic Center almost a year ago. And after the talk, a gentleman came up to me and he said, that is something that is still done today, that you place corals with a grave in order to express that the person that is buried is not from Belau, but from another island. And I think that is absolutely fascinating, that you have something that points towards a connection from a grave that is 1800 years old, and then you still have that same practice of putting corals in with the human body today in 2023. And with that, I want to thank you all for your attention, and I definitely want to thank my team, who did all the heavy lifting and were absolutely amazing and made it all happen. So thank you very much, everybody. Got it?
Oh, bên mèo quaya đi về tụt chào mà em mong sang ca Belau lingil về là ao to rar wo deli